Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining this rural education webinar today. For those of you online, and we also have a live audience with us here in the room. My name is Amy Azano, and I am a professor of rural education and the founding director for the Center for Rural Education here at Virginia Tech. And I have the honor to introduce two amazing writers, thinkers, movers, shakers, colleagues, and women and friends with me today. So Beth Macy, as many of you will know, is an award-winning journalist and best-selling author, and now a memoirist of a brand new book.
That's a fancy word, memoirist.
Yeah, a memoirist, paper girl, a memoir of home and family in a fractured America. And also with us today is Dr. Cat Biddle. Cat is an associate professor of educational leadership at the University of Maine, a rural education scholar who focuses on the ways in which rural schools and communities respond to social and economic change. And she is the co-author of Trauma Responsive Schooling, Centering Student Voice and Healing. And in the room, I know maybe people on the Zoom may not be able to see this. I'm not for sure what you all can see, but we have, just wave your hand just so that Beth and Kat will know sort of who's here with us. If you are an Appalachian student, a student from Appalachia, student from a rural area, how about that? Okay, oh, okay. And if you are a first generation student, all right. How about if you are a scholar, academic, researcher, professor? That should be the rest of everybody in the room. Anybody else? Appalachian scholars. Yes, that's right.
Scholars from the hollers.
Scholars from the hollers. And just friends of the Center for Rural Education. We're so happy that you all are here. I think a lot of people who are joining us by Zoom are folks at Virginia Tech and also in our broader rural education academic community. So we're really delighted to have you all. And so to start, I'm going to actually ask you all to continue these introductions. If you would say a little bit more about who you are and why you're with us today and what brought you to this conversation on trauma, hope, and politics, a conversation about rural education. We'll start with you. We'll start with you. Okay. We both looked at you.
Well, I'm honored to be here with both of you. Kat is featured in the book. Amy read an early version of the book and sent notes. And so I'm Beth Macy. I live just down the road in Roanoke, Virginia, where I've been a journalist for 35 years. And I was a longtime reporter for the Roanoke Times, and I quit in 2014, and I've written 5 books that are all centered in rural America. I've written 2 books about the opioid crisis, 1 book about the aftermath of globalization, and a racial history book. And now this one, which is centered in my hometown, which is a small town in a farming community called Urbana, Ohio, is about my experience being a first-generation college student, as many of you are here today, and how that saved my life. And for the book, I go back. I spent the last 2 years spending about a week, a month, embedding in my hometown and trying to describe the changes that had taken place since I left 40 years ago and what that means to the nation, and particularly at this polarized moment, what it says about America. So that's it, and I'm just really happy to be here.
Thanks.
So I'm Cat Biddle, and as Amy said, I'm at the University of Maine. I've been there for about 10 years. And I was really lucky. So I've been a scholar of rural school community relationships for about 15 years. And I was really lucky when I first got to Maine, which is a very rural state, to be invited into an initiative that became kind of my whole life for maybe 8 years. And it was started as a community-based project initiated by a group of concerned citizens in a community about 2 or 3 hours from Orono, which is where I'm based. And they were connected with some of the faculty at our institution who brought me in as an early career faculty member, which I'm so grateful for. And it was a community that was really grappling with a lot of the things that Beth writes about in her books, and particularly in this one, the effect of opioids on their community, the ways in which families, the situations in which families found themselves had changed over the decades. And they were thinking about how to better support youth within the community, and they wanted some assistance doing that. And it wasn't focused on scholarship at all. As a project, it was very much like just a group of concerned citizens coming together over many years to meet and talk about these issues. And out of this grew this project that Beth writes a little bit about in the book, which was a trauma-informed support system for some of the local schools and some community school initiatives. And so over 8 years, we grew that program, we studied it, and then we wrote this book that really focuses on the role that student voices and student agency play in supporting healing, and the ways in which schools better listening to students can help them to make that shift to trauma-informed practice. So that's...
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So for the students former students maybe in the room, you'll be familiar with this idea of the motivating discontent. And so I've asked many of my doctoral students and students over the years to think about, sort of the frustration point of your career, something that you are so discontented with that you're motivated to come back to graduate school. And so I was asking Beth and Cat, what their motivating discontent, and Cat says in her classes they call it the pebble in your shoe. And so I'd love to hear from each of you to talk about why you do the work that you do. What is your motivating discontent? Yeah, do you want to start?
Sure. So I grew up pretty darn poor. My dad was an alcoholic. My mom basically kept roof over our head. I had a grandma next door that owned our house, which kept us from being homeless some of the time, and taught me how to read when I was 4. And so I had this like personal private head start going into school. And teachers and librarians were my demigods. I loved these people. And so I was a decent student, and despite things being rough at home. And I was able to go to college, a 4-year college, a decent college. I was prepared for it because I had good schools at the time. And I was able to go entirely for free in 1982 because it was the tail end of the war on poverty when it was possible for a promising poor kid to get their college fully funded by a Pell Grant if you were poor enough, because it's need-based. So I got books, tuition, room and board, work-study jobs, so I could have pizza and beer just like everybody else. And it was still really, really hard. You guys know, you first gen know. I mean, I made a lot of mistakes. I remember one of my first job interviews, they said, "What's one word that describes you?" And I said, "I'm ambitious." I didn't know that was a bad word. I was like, how do you think I got out of where I was from? I'm freaking ambitious. So the pebble in my shoe is that we have taken away the ability for poor kids to thrive and become upwardly mobile. We, as a country, have gone from number 1 in terms of college graduation to number 13th without any discussion from the national media, which is mainly peopled by Ivy League graduates and people who weren't first-generation students, who didn't even see that it was happening. So I've been writing about this issue off and on since 1997, when I was first teaching a class, and I realized that what's going on? They're seeing Pell Grant students as like akin to welfare mothers. And that's not right either. But it's like, what is happening? We're taking this away at a moment in our history when the jobs are going away. We're saying college is more important than ever. We're decentering vocational, and we're just making everything harder, right? And so I have always written every article that I'm proud of in my whole career. I've written from the perspective of outsiders and underdogs, because I feel like that voice isn't the predominant narrative. And I think that's partly why we're so polarized now. And so this book is really a continuation of that story.
Yeah, thank you. Kat?
So I would say that the pebble in my shoe is making sure that every kid feels that they have someone that they can go to outside their family that is a trusted adult, and that they feel like they're getting the support that they need to thrive. And I'm not going to stop working until I think that happens. But the reason that I feel so strongly about this is that I feel like without the adults who I had in my life when I was younger, I would not be where I am today, because I grew up in a very disordered household. I grew up in the suburbs of Philadelphia, a really different story from Beth. And I think in a lot of ways, had every possible advantage that I could have had, but I still had a lot of adversity at home. And when I was 16, my parents were both killed in a domestic violence incident. So I was put into kinship care with my grandparents, really unusual for the community that I was in, although maybe less unusual than people thought or talked about. It was an incident that was really well covered. Everybody where I went knew what happened to me. And so I got the best possible support that my community could offer. People came out, I was never alone. Every adult was looking out for me. My school was a place that was a place of care, where I was shown every kind of understanding around assignments and attendance, and every kind of trauma-informed practice that you could imagine. I had that. And so when I think about that, some of my classmates have shared things with me in the time since then that I know they didn't get those kinds of supports. And so when I think about trauma-informed care, one of the things that I think a lot about is, how do we design systems that get to everybody, where you don't have to have a public trauma to get the kind of support that you need? And one of the other things that I really think a lot about with trauma is that it can happen to anybody, anywhere, and that every system needs to be set up with those principles in mind.
Yeah. There's a turning point in the book that you write about, sort of to blend, the two stories, your two pebbles, is that I think you went at the book to find out what was happening to or for poor kids who were growing up today. What access did they have? And you say in the book that there's a turning point that happens where it's not just that a Pell Grant is enough, that there's more that has to happen in K-12. And you actually talk about trauma-informed schooling, and of course interviewed Cat for the book. But I was wondering if you could say more about that. Like, what does that look like, both from your perspective and working with Silas, and what you saw with the attendance officer and other things that were happening, and then Cat, also with your research and practice that you're doing? Like, how do we make it happen?
Yeah. Well, we do everything Cat tells us to do, and everything
Just
Amy
in
tells
life,
us to do. Yeah.
Yeah.
Tattooed right here. So yeah, once I got out of poverty, and I was a reporter married to a school teacher, so it's not like we were still very paycheck to paycheck, but my life was easier. I lived in a happy home. My husband doesn't struggle with addiction or mental illness, and it was just like, oh, this is easy. And I felt as if I had known college would be a possibility, I would have been at the top of my class. Like, I felt like all you had to do was put billboards up in every small community saying, there is grants available. You can go if you do well in school. This will be your way out. And that's a simplistic view, because A, we took that ability away, but B, what I discovered when I started going back to Urbana, and I very much started this as an inquiry about, how do we get so divided? Why is it I can't have a conversation with my brother-in-law or ask him how he's doing without him going, deplorable? Why is it that my hometown, which was a hot spot on the Underground Railroad, that people are now flying Confederate flags? What are all these factors? And so when I go back, I start casting about for young me to write about upward mobility or declining mobility. And lo and behold, the more I report over these 2 years, the more I realize it's not about sending kids to college. It's about like making sure they don't drop out from high school. And so I saw a lot of attendance, showing up. I have a part in the book called Showing Up. So it's showing up for your family. It's how do we make workforces healthy so they're showing up for work. Every single employer in my hometown is hard up for employees. And I asked one, if you hired 10 people today, how many would be here in 6 months? And he said, 1. And we'd probably have an attendance issue with them. And then similarly in the schools, and probably these are some of the same families, the kids weren't showing up for school. So one of the main people in my book is the truancy officer attendance liaison who put 115,000 miles in her personal vehicle in 2 years, driving all over the county, taking kids who didn't show up to school. And they need about 10 of her. And she doesn't probably know the phrase trauma-informed care. She might, but she's doing the kinds of things you suggest. She is rewarding kids who are showing up, thanks to her interventions, with things that she's paying for out of her own pocketbook. She finds out what they like, what their goal is, and she helps them achieve it. And at great personal expense, she got beat up this week by a kid. And she rescued another kid who was kicked out of his home from a laundromat where she found him sleeping on a wooden table covered up by a terry cloth robe that somebody had left behind in a dryer. And just talk about the need for trauma-informed. I was just shocked over and over again by the number of kids who were molested. Almost every kid I interviewed, not just Silas, the young me, but every kid I met at the youth center. I mean, I wouldn't ask them about this, it would just come up. Even my old friends, people my age, it would just come up. And there is just, I quote an addiction scholar in the book saying, rigid thinking is a trauma response. And I just kept thinking of that quote. We need trauma-informed everything.
And that's a powerful example of, in contrast, Kat, to what you experienced as a young person, that when those traumas are invisible, right? Like they might have an opportunity to talk to you about that, but that may not come up in the school day for them. So what, in your experience, or maybe the Someday Projects or the Pet Wall, or some ways that that schools can just, build spaces of care for kids who are bringing that sort of invisible trauma to school?
Well, so one of the things that we embraced in our project is a lot of schools start trauma-informed care or a shift towards that paradigm with the idea of safety. We're going to create a safe space. So we're going to make this space calmer. We're going to cover our overhead lights. We're going to create our peace corners. And I think those are good things to do. But there are a lot of other parts of trauma-informed care that are a lot harder for schools to do. So one of them is so agency is a really big part of trauma-informed care, right? Like the ability to self-determine how you are going to the institution is going to respond to a particular type of behavior, a particular manifestation of a trauma symptom, right? And so one of the places that we started, we thought, well, what if we didn't start with safety? Because the schools seem to understand how to do that. What if we started with agency? And so one of the first things that we did to sort of as a pilot to introduce teachers to the idea of students having more control over their environment, because schools are very controlling places, right? Like I have to raise my hand to go to the bathroom. I need to get my bathroom pass. I need to be able to account for where I am at all times, right? I don't have any control over the schedule or the environment. Is we asked every kid and every teacher in the school to fill out a someday. And it said, someday in school, I wish blank. And they could write anything they wanted. And we said, look, money is real, and we, we can't, unicorns can't dance on the roof. This is in elementary school. So we were like, but, write down something that you would want. And the teachers were really scared when we did this because they were like, what if the kids ask for like really expensive things that we can't
laptops
provide?
You said, yeah.
But the things that the kids wanted were so modest and achievable. They were things like, I want to have recess with my cousin who is in the 3rd grade and I'm in the 5th grade and our recesses are at different times. Or I'm a 5th grader and I want to teach kindergarten for a day because I love spending time with little kids. Or we had one girl who wanted to do country karaoke in the gym for an hour. Or a boy who wanted to sit in the principal's chair and eat M&Ms. I mean, all of these things, eminently achievable. And so one of the first things that we did was go about making each day of the school year was some kid's Sunday. And it would be a big deal. Like it would be announced at the front of the school, and it would be announced over the loudspeaker. And some of the kids like really embraced this. And it wasn't like that they just wanted something good for themselves. They wanted something good for everybody. So one kid said, I want to start the third quarter where everybody has an 100 in the grade book so everybody can feel successful for one day. And so by giving the kids the space to determine things about the environment, the school became a more responsive place to kids. It became a place that had more kid culture in it. And that made kids want to come to school. And we saw chronic absenteeism go down, and we saw truancy go down because kids didn't want to miss their Sunday. Maybe it was going to be their day that day.
And also they celebrated each other's Sunday, right?
That's right. Yeah. We had a pre-K student who wanted to go out and look at the clouds. And the teachers would work some of the Sundays into the curriculum. So like stuffed animal day, they measured the stuffed animals, they took averages, you know.
That's great. That's great.
So, you know, there was a lot of possibility when everybody would play. One of the teachers wanted to leave school 5 minutes early so that she could meet her child at the bus. And that got to come true. Or another teacher wanted there to be a compliment day.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. I'll share my pebble in my shoe was that, well, I'll back up a little bit. So after COVID, there were some ESSER funds that came down to spend for local schools to spend on mainly curriculum and learning loss gaps that might occur during COVID. And the Coalition of Small and Rural Schools of Virginia organized a Crumbling Schools tour. And this was to convince and advocate to use those ESSER funds on capital projects. So they were looking at buildings and school buildings that really needed help. And so they chose, we have 8 superintendent regions in Virginia, and they chose 1 school per region. And the one school that they chose in Region 4 was Luray Elementary, where I went to elementary school. And it was such a point of pride for my hometown. They're like, oh my gosh, they're coming, the state superintendent and these people are coming to Luray. I'm like, it's a crumbling school story, y'all. But it was in the paper and it was like a really big deal. But I often think about that because inside that crumbling school that I went to were just fantastic teachers. And there were people who in that school saw something in me. And they said, oh, you can sit in the back of the room and read different books with your 4 friends. And I had some other extra opportunities because instead of just seeing, sort of a hyperactive, spunky kid, they gave me opportunities to fill in the spunky part of my brain. So I think about that a lot, and all of these really sort of wonderful and rich experiences I had as a young person growing up in a rural area. But because many of those needs were not necessarily met by and large, when we leave as first generation rural kids, sometimes we go to college and we don't really see a way back into our rural communities. And so I often say that my scholarship in rural education is like my prodigal daughter of the Shenandoah. Like it's my return home. If I can't physically be there, I can do research and support it in other ways. So I think for me, the rub was always that there was a message out there in the world about who we are and where we're from and what our communities are like that may not actually be how we feel and experience them firsthand. And so I think what's important about Paper Girl and many of the books that you write, Beth, and also like Demon Copperhead that I mentioned last night, Barbara Kingsolver's book, is when we get to see very complicated depictions of what rural communities are and can be and were. And it really complicates the narrative, rather than this very flat story that often gets told about us. So I would just love to know, how do we continue to tell complex narratives about rural people and places? How can we, Kat and I spent a lot of time thinking about how can we bring Beth's work into conversation with rural education scholarship as maybe a praxis. What can we do with this now that we have another complex story about, sort of who we are and where we're from, and where's the hope in that, and where's the complex narrative that we can tell? Do you have any impressions on that?
Well, I've said this to, I don't know if I've said this to you, I said this to Amy, but when I picked up Paper Girl and when I read it, I thought this is what I wanted Hillbilly Elegy to be, and it wasn't, because it got at the complexity of the story in a way that there's an entry point for every single person. And one of the things I heard after your talk last night too was these personal stories pouring out of people in the conversation that was happening, where every single person could relate to something in this book. And I think that's what happens when you get true complex narrative that captures and resonates with people's experience in the way that sometimes academia can be very reductive, right? Because we're very single issue, we've got journal space limitations. And, you know, we're also focused on explaining. And I think one of the things that your book does so well is it sits in the ambiguity of, these are all the things that are happening, and we can see some whys, but also there are still questions. And I feel like being able to hold that ambiguity is where we're gonna, is the way forward.
Yeah.
And I just feel called to tell the stories of rural America because they're rarely called. And unless it's hillbilly elegy, and Vance totally overlooks the systemic centuries of history that have destroyed Appalachia, starting with the out-of-state coal miners and the land grabs, and then Purdue Pharma, you know, purposely targeting these areas where the jobs had already gone away and there were workforce injuries. And I don't think I've told this story here today, but excuse me, I've been a lot of places lately.
Taking her around.
I pitched Dope Sick to be my second book. It's my third book. But I couldn't convince the gatekeepers in New York, where most of our news is manufactured, by the way, in big cities. I couldn't convince them that what I was seeing on the ground in Roanoke, Virginia, which was an exploding heroin epidemic in the wealthiest suburbs, where all the parents wanted to keep it hidden because of stigma. And I couldn't convince them that there was a heroin problem until 2015, economists come out with data showing that our life expectancy is going down for the first time since World War I. And then I can go back with data and I can say, look, I've been here. Y'all should have listened to me the first time, right? And so, you know, I don't know what we do in this declining media environment where, you know, 91% of the localities that went heavily for Trump were news deserts, because people in my hometown don't have a reliable source of local news. They know everything that's being said on Newsmax and Fox, but nothing about their neighbors. And those are the bread and butter stories of my career at the Roanoke Times. I didn't just write dark stuff. I wrote about Selena Sullivan, the young woman from the projects, who not only was the first in her family to go to college, she was the first in her neighborhood. And she went to Harvard. She now runs a library around the corner from me. I'm sorry, down the street from me. She owns a house around the corner from me. And these are the kinds of stories that we need to be telling. And we don't have a model yet for how to get those stories out there.
So the stories, and also, and then I'm gonna start thinking about a question if anybody has one, but something else that you said that we picked up on in the book and other places that you've written is about, like, sort of when we say like a way out, like as we think about college. And so part of what we have done in our, you know, y'all, I'm gonna talk about CVT, because every time I have a gathering of people, I'm always gonna talk about our summer enrichment experience at Virginia Tech, CVT, our summer camp for rural youth. But I think it's one of those ways to help sort of engender this idea that we can do both things at the same time, that this is not an either or situation. We can support rural youth in ways that also help them see that there's a bright, vibrant future for them, and that future can be back in the rural communities that they grew up in if they want to return. So if they want to stay, it should be because they want to stay, not because that feels like the only option that they have. If they want to enter a trade, it should be because that trade, we were talking about valuing the trades in college, you know, on equal footing, but it should be because college is as much a choice that they would have as that trade, but that there's some decision making that young people can have. And I think that I'm hoping that these stories and the stories that we're telling, and then the young people as they come to our CVT, our camp, and other opportunities like that becomes part of their story, where they say, yeah, I went to Virginia Tech, but I actually learned about my rural community and why this is really important. We hope that becomes part of the story that they tell as they grow up. But I would love to get a question. I have so many more for us, but if anybody has something that they'd like to, yeah.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. And I've been thinking a lot, and I kind of always think about the questions that you were just talking about, right? And like why people have such a reaction to these, like hearing these complex stories, and why they suddenly start telling their own stories, and the degree to which, for many of us who come from rural communities, there's a feeling that you have to suppress that in operating in the world, right? So it's not just that the stories are told, but that the kind of normative expectations for how you behave and how you engage, whether it's from your accent, which I got rid of because I got mocked in college, to, any number of other things, right? Talking about your family without having somebody do the banjo from Deliverance, right? Which literally happened to me every single day in Michigan when I lived there for 12 years, right? So those kinds of things are super traumatic. But one of the questions that I wonder, and I would be really curious to hear you all talk about, I mean, I think most of us, or all of us in this room, would probably talk about how education is life-saving for us, right? How it's transformative. But I'm also really curious to think about, like, what happens when people get to college, right? And yes, there's opportunity. I had opportunity. I was telling Kat those stories last night. Amy's heard them before. But there's also ways in which we end up having to fracture ourselves in order to survive in higher education, to be seen and legible and not be disrespected as stupid and be taken seriously and, learn to operate. And so within higher education, right, we talk a lot about various kinds of marginalized communities and how we support them, but rurality has almost entirely been ignored, right? Or gets lumped in with first generation, or gets lumped in with poor students, or gets lumped in with a bunch of other things, and it's more complicated than that, right? So, like, what does it look like for higher ed, not just centers like Amy's wonderful center, right? But like more systemically, right? What does it mean for us to transform that and create educational systems and institutions that don't require us to fracture ourselves in order to operate in the world?
Yeah. Thank you, Jennifer. Do you want to take? I mean, you go first.
Well, I was going to say I have a wonderful colleague at UMaine who thinks about these and writes about these issues really well, and her name is Kathleen Gillen. And I think that she and I would agree that there's a really, really important, I would agree that I think every higher ed institution has to take these issues seriously, right? But who's best positioned to take these issues seriously? And I think it's land-grant institutions, that this is part of. And I think I probably romanticize the land-grant legacy like a little too much. But I do think that that at its heart, it has a good mission, right? Which is like serve the people around you, serve the state as it is, meet people where they are. And so if we're going to take that seriously as institutions, then what are the implications for our supports along the way? What are our affinity groups looking like? How are we connecting our course curriculum content back to the communities that our students come from? And that is about a partnership question. So
yeah. And I would just say too, for those especially who, we have a group at the National Rural Education Association where we convene aspiring centers. So, some of the folks who are listening may not have a affinity space or anything like that at their institution, but we wanted to be a lot more than that when we started the Center for Rural Education. And we always talk about, we have 3 focus areas. So one is our K-12 partnerships and doing things like a summer camp. But the other is meeting the needs of our students who show up at our back to school events their very first month at Virginia Tech. And then we get them to do all the things with us. But it's not just that. It's not just having a place for people to convene. It is making sure that you're also talking to your admissions officers, making sure that you're talking to your data people. Are we even keeping track of where people are applying for? Are we looking at that? I found out at Virginia Tech we weren't until a couple years ago. We developed a study abroad program. So when students do come, when you defy the odds, you find yourself here, then what do you have the same access to what it means to be a Hokie or whatever your mascot or whatever the branding is? This is home. Well, is it for everybody? Does everybody have access to opportunities? And so we weren't sure that that was the case. And so we started a study abroad program designed specifically for rural students, particularly first gen, who may not have had a passport and might be traveling abroad for the first time. And we wanted to do that in a way that helps a young person gain some social capital out there in the world, but without that fracturing. So you can still talk to grandma when you go home on the breaks, because that class recognizes that that there's value being from a rural place. You don't have to give that up just because you've been somewhere fancy and you've been to an international airport. So I think there are more and more things that we can do, but I would just say leveraging whatever it is that you're doing at your institution to make sure that people see those rural students in all of the ways that they're bright and dynamic, and putting them in front of lots of people to say, like, you're our future, this is we have two, I don't know what the people in the webinar can say, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but we have students like that who show up every day. And to your point though, Jennifer, like I've had other professors say to me, like, how do I encourage my rural students to stay more in the classroom, because they might be self-conscious. Even though our institution sits here in Central Appalachia, there are a lot of kids from Nova, for those of you listening, that's Northern Virginia. And I often say, we're from Rova, the rest of Virginia, and we have an accent. And like Jennifer, this is a dialed back version of it, but get me a Luray with a beer and it'll come right out. But so I think I really appreciate your question. I think it's something, I don't know if you experienced that, but I experienced that. I was called a hick and much worse. I mean, so much name calling when I went to college. I didn't know I had an accent. I didn't know greasy didn't have a Z, it was greasy, and polecats I didn't know anything. I didn't know how to act. I didn't know how to be in that space.
And you probably didn't have the confidence yet to share with others, because there were probably other people feeling that too.
Yeah,
I know. I felt like a food stamp recipient in a line at Whole Foods, and I just went to a cost cutter 4-year college, Bowling Green State University, a land grant university, and I interviewed Ruby Payne. She's a poverty scholar for the book, and she was talking about like how wealthy people have codes, like unspoken codes of behavior. Like one of the things really wealthy generational wealth families do is they always have a lawyer and a finance person. Like they are encouraged to marry into this so that you have somebody in your family that can help protect your wealth. WTF, are you kidding me? Really, they do this? And it's like such a different world, but of course they do this. And I'm just thinking of like examples, when I had my first out-of-state job, I was hired to work at the Savannah newspaper. I didn't know, because no one in my family had ever moved out of state for work, that I could ask for moving expenses. So I asked my friend, because I'm scrappy and rural, if he could borrow his dad's truck and move me to Georgia from Ohio. I went sight unseen. I didn't even know what the place looked like. And then later, a colleague said, "Oh, you could have gotten moving expenses." Like that's just like we almost need a little bookmark with all the things we don't know, right? Yeah. And it's like it's the passport. It's like I didn't know that I could apply to be study abroad. I totally could have. It would have changed my life. But nobody I knew had ever studied abroad. And how would you know?
Yeah, how would you know?
And we're so, I don't know, at least in my experience, I'm so ashamed of like being from poverty. I would act like I sort of make up for it because I was class clown, and I would make up for it. Like I partied a lot and I was popular, but it was a really hard space. I can remember, this is before cell phones. I would call my mom crying from the payphone. Like everybody could probably hear me, just like, this is hard. And thank God she didn't say, "Come on home, Beth," because it probably would have.
Yeah, that's right. Were you gonna?
I was going to say, one of the texts that we spend a lot of time talking about in my sociology of education class is Jessica Calarco's Negotiating Opportunity, which is really about, it kind of turns what you just said on its head, which is it says that, like, basically she talks about the ways in which middle class kids and upper middle class and upper class kids are coached to negotiate for more than their fair share in any given situation. And that part of our job as educators is actually to make the rules so clear that that kind of advantage seeking is not possible. But it's really, really hard to do because there's a lot of political power behind that.
Yeah, that's great. Other questions? I think there, Josh had his hand up.
Well, as you were talking, I also thought, I didn't know what venison was. I was like, oh, deer meat, right? Like that's another classic example of that. But I have two questions that I see connections. I'm just going to ask them both, and you can talk about whatever you want to talk about. I could sit and listen to you talk for like an hour about anything. But I'm just kind of wondering, like, thinking about where we are currently, like in our climate, and I feel like more people who thought that the system worked for them or the systems work for them are starting to see, oh, it's me too, right? And I think that we're at a time where like maybe we can help push this title more. And so the question is kind of like, well, from your own work, kind of what do we do now? I know Beth earlier were like, I don't know what to do now, and I was like,
no, I have thoughts. I have thoughts on that one.
Yeah, and then go ahead with that question.
Okay. Do you mind if I read a little section?
No.
So I'm rural, so you can't write a book about where you're from without talking about the county fair. So I have a whole chapter on going back to the county fair, which has been in existence since 1842. Wow. And the week before I was there, an off-duty cop got arrested for carrying a gun into the fair. And because there were signs saying no open carry at the fair. Well, they put him in jail. He wouldn't return his weapon to the car. And then the Ohio gun owners got really upset about that. And so the next day they showed up with even bigger weapons and purposely got themselves arrested. And then so they could lawyer up, in their words, and make sure that the fair was, not violating their constitutional rights. So I began kind of stalking them online. And they would put up, the leader would wear a shirt that said, ATF is gay. And he would post these memes that said, this is in the run up to the 24 election, these long memes with like, train daily, eat red meat, buy ammo, repeat. Wow. So at the end of the book, like the election has happened, I'm foreseeing, although it was much worse, it's been much worse than I thought it would be, but I'm trying to write a book that's going to come out now and is still going to be relevant. So I'm like, what have I learned? What is my advice? So I do, I'm just going to read a little bit. If that little girl in the lilacs poring over the library's copy of Harriet the Spy can go to college and have nice things, won't that just make it harder for my own kids to get ahead? So this is the upper middle class entitlement you were just talking about. I say, it won't. The answer to poorly performing public schools isn't to pull out all the high achievers and segregate them from the stragglers. It's to strengthen the most fundamental unit of a democratic society, our public schools. The answer to our epidemic of loneliness isn't to seek solace in conspiracy theories. It's to participate in real life with other human beings, including people we don't know. With a nod to the Ohio gun owners, so I'm going to create my own meme here, may I suggest that we instead touch grass, take a walk with a friend, buy diapers for a nonprofit dedicated to low-wage moms, help mutual aid groups led by people in struggle. Where it is safe to do so, underline, underscore, put it in bold, if it's safe, because I don't think marginalized people who are worried about their safety should be leading this charge, but it's up to the rest of us to do it. Try to mend frayed connections by practicing grace. In the words of Barbara Kingsolver, love stays alive if you tend it like a flame. Support local news, run for office, and or support candidates who are trying to change things for the better for the most people. Repeat. Like many of my friends who are scared about living under a fascist regime, I love the idea of moving to Portugal. I also dream about moving to my ancestral homeland of Ireland, where my hip pain went away, just as my niece's eczema did. And I talk about this trip we went on. But there is a world of resistance to hatred and systemic betrayal of democracy that demands us to stay and fight. We must scramble for hope fiercely. the way a farm girl wrestles a muddy sow. And so that's like me putting my journalist hat aside and saying, it's fucking on, people. We've got to fight. So I think that's what we have to do.
Yeah. Reactions to that, if anybody has a question. Oh, Macy's clapping. A hell yeah.
Oh, no. I mean, I have a question.
We know you do.
I mean, I always have questions. But when you think about land-grant universities and how you have rural students going to these places and are actually achieving, like, why are these universities not reaching into rural communities more? So, like, us, for example, we don't go past, like, you have students who've never seen the Appalachian Mountains be like, I don't go past Blacksburg because Blacksburg has nothing. But, like, you need to learn the space that you're in when you're in communities like this. Like, my frustration is you have people who don't know these places and they come to Blacksburg and they're like, Blacksburg's the middle of nowhere, but you don't know that there's a whole nother point of Virginia that people forget about. But there are people who come out of these places that are actually doing things. And it's like, it's frustrating for me. It's when universities like Virginia Tech don't go into these places and don't acknowledge that there are people who are still suffering.
Yeah.
Like, me and Jamie are in a class, we're going to Welch to help people who are still recovering from floods that happened in February. But we have 40,000 people on this campus who you could activate to actually go help and make a change. So I guess my question is, like, how would you do that when using land grant status to help poor places that are rural?
Gosh.
Organize.
Yeah, organize.
Organize. I mean, exactly what you're doing.
And I think it starts earlier. I do. And Amy's written about this extensively. And, you know, we've written a little bit about it together. But, like, the deficit narrative of rural is so strong, right? That's what we're fighting in some ways. And if you grow up, I mean, you talk to any kid. I do focus groups with kids all the time, and they say this is the middle of nowhere. And I think, but look at everything around here. You know, for me, it starts with teaching kids to appreciate the place that they're from through the curriculum, right? Like, seeing all the abundance, seeing all the things that are good, seeing all the opportunity and potential, you know, and learning to work with people in place, right? But so that then when they come to Virginia Tech, they hold Tech accountable. Or when they come to the University of Maine, they hold Maine accountable for that, right? You know, for their own communities. And that's where I think the power of the organizing comes from, is that sense of, like, I'm entitled for my community to thrive.
Yeah.
Every place is as important as the next.
Yeah. What I appreciate about what you're asking, Macy, too, is that there's a conversation here that many of us have been part of, I'm pointing at you, Katie, on being a global distinction, being a university of global distinction, and many of the department heads and center directors who are here, we get a lot of that conversation. And I think what you're pointing out is that when we do things well at home, when we take care of home, that is going to give us that global distinction. If we could, like you said, mobilize the 40,000 people that we have on campus to care for this community, to care for Appalachia, imagine the global distinction that we would have to say, look at what this university is doing to take care of their neighbors, to take care of this community. And I think as we think about our reach and that sort of global presence that we have, let's not lose sight of, like, you know, like, you know, my dad would say, do good at home, do good at home first. And then that's what gets you a reputation. And so let's do that. Let's do more of that. You're graduating in May, but
nobody else does it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. That's right. And I'm hopeful that centers like we have also here, the Center for Refugee, Migrant, and Displacement Studies, which doesn't just look at the issue of, and we can talk about this, Katie and Deirdre, on issues of migration and refugees, but also in rural communities, our migrant populations and refugees are making a home here in the New River Valley in Blacksburg, Virginia. And that's going to look really different than if you were a refugee and you're in New York City. So what are the resources like here, and what can we do to build up those resources so that people see a refugee or a migrant as a neighbor, as part of this
Particularly now
community?
as the federal
Yes.
cuts are
Yes.
really impacting,
Yeah. Yeah.
supportive services.
And we want to talk about those cuts, but yeah. Oh yeah, Jamie.
Going off of what you were just talking about, a question popped into my mind of a lot of these rural spaces and rural communities. I grew up on the eastern side of this county, so very local, but a lot of these more rural spaces and communities that grow up are kind of near like Virginia Tech or near universities like this. There's a lot of distrust from the communities to the institutions from years and years and years of things that the institution has been doing to kind of take advantage of these communities or resources or people. And kind of when we're talking about what Macy was saying, reaching into those communities, how do we build back that trust that over like centuries that we've lost, you know?
Yeah. Oh, I have so many thoughts about this, but I've talked a lot, and you are my guest. Do you have any?
Showing up.
With a
making-
spirit of humility.
Yeah, with a spirit of humility, absolutely. One of the things we do in Roanoke, we have this group called Do Good Virginia, and I talked about it a bit last night, but we brought in authoritarian scholar Andrea Pitzer from DC at one of our first meetings after the election, and she said, you know, we've got to try to ameliorate these cuts that are coming down, but not just in our one little friend group. We've got to start to patch together all these different groups. So if I were you, I would be, you know, joining with other organizers that maybe have different goals and seeing how you can organize together, right? Because that's been really powerful. So not only do we rally outside of our congressman's office, we raise money for these groups that are being harmed. We bring food every Monday. We take diapers for the diaper bank. And, you know, we're encouraging people to run for office. And like these are kind of weekly things we're now doing that are part of what we do. Every Monday I go do this. Every Tuesday I do this. And it's really affirming, it gives you your power back, and it helps the community. So it's just a win-win-win.
Yeah. I would say too, Jamie, to your question, like especially in this region where so many extractive industries have done harm, and that's been repeated time and time again. And so we don't want our communities to think of education as being one of those extractive industries, right? We're seeing that this polarization, I would say political rhetoric right now is serving as an extractive industry. It's because we don't have reliable news sources. This is happening again, but we've seen it with coal. We've seen it with the prisons that, you know, a promise of prisons that were built in Appalachia, and we've seen it. So I think and
now we're seeing it with people's brains.
Yeah. And I think that, you know, it's to build back that trust is to go into communities to say, you know, how can we serve you, right? Like to be a real partner, a true partner, a trusted broker in that space. And we have a wonderful example from Monuments Across Appalachian Virginia who've done this the MAV way, that done this particularly well as they've thought about with a Mellon Foundation grant to build monuments, to reconceptualize what a monument is, but to work with communities to say, what does this community need? What story has not been told here? And to let the people in that space identify what that is, and then give the resources, whether that's faculty leads or all of the different things that they've done. And you can find more about that project if you just Google that, Monuments Across Appalachian Virginia. But 8-9 wonderful examples of what that has looked like. But I think that's how you build back trust. And to also recognize, which I think MAV does really well, that in doing that work, it's hard work, it's complicated work, not everyone will agree, but to create a safe space for people to have those conversations, I think is really key. And because we cannot let people think that, and also higher education has to do that work too. Are we actually, you know, when people say the argument, well, we're bringing kids here and we're brainwashing, and I had an uncle ask me, and with such kindness, you know, the way that you talk about someone asking about Sasha in the book, your brother asking about Sasha, but my uncle who asked me and said, you know, are y'all doing that Marxist stuff when kids come? Are y'all really doing that? You know, and if you really think about the answer to that question, are we making spaces on college campuses to really honor the different places that kids might come from and who their families are and the different ideas that they're bringing to the classroom. Is it truly a safe space for people to have difference and for us to honor that difference? And I think if we're honest about that, is it a place, we don't want to be dogmatic. And so can we create more spaces to have complicated, safe conversations? And I don't know that we've done that well, but I know that we have to do it now because education's at risk. And in the book, we're getting short on time, but Beth also writes about homeschooling. And so if people see even K-12 spaces that are no longer safe spaces, or, I won't say safe in that way, but like spaces where they don't want to send their kid for a variety of reasons, then what does that mean if, for a democracy that's built where K-12 has always been an essential ingredient in the democratic promise of the United States. And so if that's now seen as something that can no longer be trusted, we're in real trouble. But I promised that we would talk about hope. And so I don't want to end on that note. And so I'd love for like a final question to lift us up. And that is a wonderful question because I do think it can build trust and hope. But Jennifer,
I just wanted to make sure, because they're undergrads and there are undergrads and they're my undergrads, and I just want to make sure that they feel supported. I mean, they're amazing, right? But I also want you all to know, because it's like we often talk about like big systemic change, right? And you all are in parts of those, you're in those conversations often, but I also don't want you to feel like you have to be responsible for carrying the reputation of the university and restoring the reputation of the university in the community. That's the university leader's responsibility. Mm-hmm. And that also goes for every faculty member and graduate student and whatever doing amazing work, right? We represent the university in many ways, but we are also ourselves. And if institutional leaders don't do the things that need to be done and are willing to commit to doing those things, we don't carry that burden, but it doesn't mean that we can't still do the good work to build the relationships, because we still are people from rural communities who have those kinds of relationships and know the kind of distrust that exists for higher education in general, not necessarily just for our institution. So there's still things we can do. You just don't have to carry everything on your back.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I just throw in one hopeful story?
Yes, hopeful. Let's end on hope. And
so, does anybody here know the work of the illustrator and novelist Robert Geit from Eastern Kentucky? So I call him my Appalachian sensei. He worked for years at a community college in Harlan, Kentucky, and he was there on the ground when the opioid crisis first hit. And in real time, he had the presence of mind, probably in the aughts, to have his students go out and collect the stories of what was happening in the community. So they interviewed their parents, their grandparents, their uncle, and then he gathered all these stories as an amazing oral history, right? And then they created art out of it. And so it's called Higher Ground. And it's a reference to the fact that in rural areas, in the mountains, there are these floods, and maybe you don't talk to your neighbor because you have beef with them going back to 1947. But when the floods happen, everybody has to work together. And so that's the metaphor for Higher Ground. And then they produce these plays, which are these amazing stories. And so and the actors are the people in the community themselves. And so I just think and when I asked him about it, I did a profile for a magazine about him. I said, what was your goal? He said, I just wanted to help the community come together in a way that would help them process their trauma and their grief. And he comes up with art that's funny as hell and really supportive of people. And they've gone on to do amazing things and start recovery centers and all these other things. And so I think there are, and I think you guys being hubs in your regions, this is Maine and Virginia.
I thought that was Cat Biddle. I was like, we worked together for a long time.
That you're the repository, you're doing this cutting edge research of what is happening and what works. And people in some communities don't even know about Someday. They don't even know about Higher Ground. They don't even know about MAV. And to get the word out is just incredible. And to everybody watching for online, who is also doing this work, I just want to thank you, because I really mean it when I say every place is important as the next.
What about you, Kat? What makes you feel hopeful?
I think two things make me feel hopeful. One is that every teacher I know who gets up every day and goes into the classroom day after day after day after day, when I know how hard it is to face a kid doing the exact same thing that they did the first 179 days of the school year, and they still have the patience to be with that kid and meet that kid where they are, that gives me hope. And I think that the more that we can go out of our way in our everyday lives to like support the people in front of us, and not to the exclusion of the people who aren't in front of us, right? But build those high quality relationships and show up and meet those people where they are every day. Like that's the trauma-informed care. Like if everybody did that, we would have a trauma-informed world, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that's what gives me hope, is teachers who keep going to their jobs.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And what gives me hope are all the people right here in the room that you keep showing up, especially a shout out to the staff and but like everything that the Center for Rural Education, if you're here, thank you so much for everything that you have done. And the people who showed up last night, the people who are reading the book, the people who are still reading our journal articles and citing those, that's amazing. I think that we are still hopeful that we can get this right and we can support rural students across the lifespan. And I'm so delighted that you all were here. Thank you so much for this conversation. For those of you online, I'm going to follow up to see if we might do like a little book study on Paper Girl. It'd be really cool to stay connected and maybe have another webinar, something that we can put together. So if you're out there and you haven't read it and you want to, I'll follow up with you on an email to see if we can
reader's
get
guide online
on
my
that,
website.
on Penguin. Yeah. Okay.
It's
good.
really good.
Okay, good. So we could stay in conversation about how to put some of Beth's work, because Kat and I were saying that your previous books have been really important for the field as we think about the systemic and structural inequities that exist and that are influencing sort of that rural ecosystem around mental health and wellness and schooling in rural places. So I'd love to keep in touch, and if we get a community together, maybe you can pop in on one of our webinars. I know. But thank you all so much for coming. Thank you all for being online. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.